The sound of hammers and jackhammers was the first thing that woke me up that morning. I was still tucked up in the covers, trying to ignore the chaos outside, but when the screams started, I knew I had to get up, because those were no ordinary construction site screams. They were screams of pure hatred, and my sister was in the middle of them. I ran outside and almost tripped over the debris. My sister's access ramp? Reduced to rubble. Chunks of concrete were scattered across the sidewalk as if a hurricane had blown through. The neighbors watched with the typical expression of those who love to see the circus on fire, but don't want to get involved. And, at the center of the mess, there she was, the woman who had been making our lives hell for months, Karen. She was holding a clipboard with her nose held high, surrounded by two HOA employees who looked more embarrassed than convinced. My sister, on the other hand, was red with anger, and rightly so. That ramp was essential for her to get in and out of the house, but for Karen, it was just a violation of community rules. My sister didn't need to say anything for me to understand what was going on. The look on her face said it all. The HOA, in its dictatorial zeal to keep all the houses with the same aesthetic, had decided that an access ramp was too ugly for the neighborhood. Yes, because apparently, accessibility is less important than the visual harmony of a bunch of bland houses painted in the same soulless beige palette. Karen's excuse? You should have asked permission before building. Oh, right. As if she was going to approve anything. This woman would do anything to keep her domestic dictatorship intact, even if it meant making my sister's life a living hell. But what Karen didn't know, and what made the whole thing delicious, was that my sister wasn't just anyone. She was a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. My sister dealt with heavy cases, the kind that make entire opposition offices break out in a cold sweat. If there was anyone capable of turning that situation into a legal nightmare for the HOA, it was her. But at the moment, my sister was still in the stage of disbelief. She was taking deep breaths, trying to contain her outburst. And me? Well, I'm not that patient. You know this is illegal, right? I snapped, crossing my arms. Karen didn't even blink. The ramp was in breach of regulations. It was removed according to the guidelines in our bylaws. The bylaws. The damn HOA bylaws. That little book Karen probably hugged before going to sleep. I looked at my sister. She wiped her hands across her face, took a deep breath, then faced the woman with a dangerous smile. So, this is how you want to play? That's great. That's when I knew. The HOA had just bought a very, very expensive fight. My sister didn't scream. She didn't scream. She didn't make a fuss in the street, despite all the anger shining in her eyes. What did she do? She smiled. That calm, sharp smile that anyone with a modicum of survival instinct would know how to interpret as a signal to run in the opposite direction. But Karen? Oh, Karen was too stubborn to realize that she was about to stick her face in a nest of marimbondos. While the HOA was mentally congratulating itself on yet another act of aesthetic maintenance, my sister simply took out her cell phone, snapped a few photos of the wreckage, and went back into the house without saying a word. I followed her, because I knew exactly what was coming next. She opened her laptop, adjusted her glasses, and started typing as if she were writing someone's obituary. And, in a way, she was. Because if there was one thing my sister knew how to do, it was sue someone for every penny. While she was putting together her case, I decided to take a look at the HOA's website, just to see if there was any official notice about this shenanigans. And guess what? There was. A discreet little notice, almost as if they were trying to hide it, said, "Unauthorized structures that violate community uniformity guidelines are subject to removal without notice." Without notice. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but even I know that sounds very, very illegal. And my sister, being a lawyer, certainly knew that better than anyone. "So?" I asked, leaning against the door. She didn't look away from the screen. "They've violated the Disabled Persons Act." Ah, that would be nice. The HOA, in its aesthetic outburst and thirst for power, hadn't just destroyed a ramp. They had violated federal rights. And if there's one thing the U.S. federal government doesn't like, it's people who screw around with accessibility. While she was putting together her legal piece, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. I wanted to see if the neighbors were aware of the bomb that was about to explode. The first person I met was Mr. Thompson, the pensioner who lived 2 houses down. He was on the balcony, shaking his head and drinking coffee as if he'd seen this kind of nonsense before. "What do you think of this mess?" I asked, pointing to the wreckage of the ramp. He sighed. "It's not the first time this woman has crossed the line, but she always gets away with it. Maybe before, but now she had chosen the wrong victim." I continued my rounds and heard stories that only increased my contempt for the HOA. One neighbor said that Karen had already fined a resident for having an unapproved shade of green on his front door. Another said that she picked on the height of fences as if it were a matter of national security. In other words, Karen had been making life hell for everyone for a long time, but no one had ever really stood up to her, until now. When I got home, my sister already had a plan. "We're not just going to sue, we're going to destroy this HOA. She filled me in on the details and, my friend, I almost felt sorry for Karen. Almost. First, she contacted the Department of Justice. Yes, that Department of Justice. Because, as a lawyer, she knew exactly where to turn when an HOA decides to play God with the affordability of residents. Then she filed for formal mediation. This meant that the HOA would have to explain its actions in front of a legal authority before the process even began. And the icing on the cake? She made sure to send a copy of the request to all HOA board members, ensuring that the gossip spread like wildfire through dry straw. The next day, Karen knocked on our door. She seemed different, less confident, less, "I'm the queen of this neighborhood and you're my subjects. We need to talk," she said, with a tense smile. My sister crossed her arms. "Now you want to talk?" Karen sniffled, clearly uncomfortable. "Maybe we can come to an agreement." Ah, now she wanted a deal. After demolishing the ramp, bragging about it, pretending it was her right, my sister smiled. "Ah, we'll reach an agreement. Yes, in court." And then she shut the door in her face. Now, we just had to wait. And I couldn't wait to see the look on the HOA's face when it realized the size of the hole it had gotten itself into. The HOA thought it was going to get away with it. It thought it would continue doing whatever it wanted, hiding behind ridiculous rules and a statute that only served to feed the president's ego. But what they didn't count on was a determined lawyer and an entire neighborhood about to explode with accumulated hatred. While my sister was orchestrating her legal offensive, the neighborhood was on fire. Word of the lawsuit spread faster than gossip in a Facebook group. Everyone wanted to know if Karen was finally going to get the beating she deserved. And the answer came quickly. The HOA received a formal notice from the Department of Justice that they were being investigated for a possible violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. In other words, the federal government now had its eyes on them. If the HOA felt powerful before, now the entire board must have been scared shitless. On the same day, another bombshell dropped. The request for mediation was accepted, and the HOA was ordered to appear for a preliminary hearing. And as if that weren't enough, my sister filed a civil suit demanding not only the reconstruction of the ramp, but also moral damages and financial compensation. The icing on the cake? My sister made a point of recording all this in a collective email and sent it to everyone in the neighborhood. The chaos was immediate. In the neighborhood group, people finally found the courage to expose everything the HOA had been up to. One resident said that he had received repeated fines because his fence was 3 centimeters higher than allowed. A woman revealed that she was forced to change the blinds on her windows because they didn't match the aesthetic standard. And there was even a case of a couple fined for putting a swing in the yard for their children. It was official. The neighborhood had had enough of the HOA's dictatorship. But Karen? Ah, this woman refused to admit defeat. She continued to cling to the narrative that she was just enforcing the rules, as if that justified taking down an essential ramp for a disabled person. But even the other HOA members began to realize that they were sinking with her. After all, no one wanted to be the target of a federal lawsuit. And then came the emergency HOA meeting. They say it was a spectacle. The residents were furious. The board was nervous. And Karen, she tried to hold it together, but you could see on her face that the situation had gotten out of hand. The president of the HOA, who had previously supported everything she did, now wanted to get as far away as possible. "We need to reconsider this situation," he said, trying to calm things down. Karen snorted. "Reconsider? Are we going to bow to this blackmail now?" Ah, denial. Always the most beautiful phase before the fall. Meanwhile, my sister waited patiently. She knew she was winning. She knew that the HOA was beginning to realize that it had poked the wrong person. And then came the final blow. The HOA received an ultimatum from my sister's lawyer. Either they rebuilt the ramp and paid compensation for the damage, or they would face a long and extremely expensive lawsuit that, in the end, would probably wipe out the entire association. The next day, Karen showed up at our door again, but this time her arrogance was gone. She was pale. The smug smile, it had evaporated. The woman looked like someone who had just attended her own funeral. "Can we sort this out without involving any more lawyers?" she asked, her voice much less confident than before. My sister looked at her, crossed her arms and smiled. "But the lawyers are already involved, Karen." Karen closed her eyes and let out a heavy sigh. For the first time, she really looked defeated. "What do you want?" My sister didn't even hesitate. "Rebuild the ramp, pay for the damage, and resign from the HOA." Karen widened her eyes as if she'd been slapped. "Resign? That's ridiculous." "No, what you've done is ridiculous. You and this association have made everyone's life a living hell for far too long. If you leave now, maybe you'll have a little dignity left." Karen tried to argue. She tried to say that it wasn't like that she was only doing what was right for the community. But it was too late. She had lost. And even worse, she knew it. Over the next few days, things began to change. The HOA relented and had the ramp rebuilt. The compensation check arrived the following week. And Karen? Oh, Karen was forced to resign. Her fall from grace was spectacular. From queen of the HOA to a social pariah in record time. The neighbors who once bowed their heads to her now completely ignored her. She became the woman who ruined the HOA and nearly sunk everyone in a federal lawsuit. And honestly, it was beautiful to see. The HOA, without Karen at the helm, became much less aggressive. The excessive fines disappeared. The absurd rules began to be revised. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood could breathe a sigh of relief. My sister didn't celebrate in public, but I knew that inside she was savoring every second of this victory. The HOA tried to knock down her ramp, but in the end, it was she who knocked the HOA down. The smell of fresh coffee was in the air, but it wasn't enough to ease the tension hanging over our house. I still couldn't believe we were at this point. The whole neighborhood was watching us, and every day, it seemed, the tension grew. My sister, with her unflappable gaze, was focused on the computer screen, finalizing the last details of the legal offensive against the HOA. What had seemed like a simple battle for a ramp was now turning into a relentless war. And the army? Well, the army was her, the most fearless lawyer I've ever met. The emergency HOA meeting was the next day, and things were about to get even more interesting. Rumors about the lawsuit ran like wildfire. I didn't know what was more satisfying, seeing the look of dread on the residents' faces as justice approached, or knowing that Karen was about to be swallowed up by everything she had caused. Because, until that moment, no one had the courage to stand up to this woman's tyranny. But my sister, with her meticulously calculated patience, knew that the right time to act was now. In the days leading up to the meeting, the pressure was mounting. The HOA kept sending messages and tentative agreements, as if that would solve the problem. They thought they could buy our peace with some kind of derisory compensation. something they would do just to shut up the neighborhood and try to put out the fire they themselves had caused. But what they didn't understand was that my sister wasn't playing their game. She was playing a totally different game, one that would involve much more than just rebuilding the ramp. The night before the meeting, she told me, "They're scared. It's not just the ramp. They know that what we've done will cause a chain reaction. If we win this, other communities will start questioning the HOA's abuses. They won't want to be next." And she was right. What seemed like a simple fight for a wheelchair ramp now represented a bigger change. It was symbolism, a cry against abuses of power that had been ignored for too long. No one else would be the target of Karen's obsessions and her adoration for her statute of meaningless rules. On the day of the meeting, the neighborhood seemed to be on the warpath. When the time came, I accompanied her to the HOA room, where everyone was gathered, with their faces closed and their conversations quick. Karen was there, as always, feeling like the boss, but her posture had changed. The arrogance that used to be visible was now concealed by a nervousness that she tried to disguise. But anyone who knew Karen knew that she was in shock, and the reason was simple. She knew that her defeat was imminent. The HOA members were visibly uncomfortable, and when my sister entered the room, the atmosphere became even heavier. It wasn't long before the president of the HOA, the man who had always stood next to Karen, asked to open the meeting. "Well, everyone, thank you for being here. We're going to address the ramp situation and the points raised in the lawsuit." My sister didn't let him finish. "I'm not here to talk about a settlement," she said, her voice firm but without losing her cool. "I'm here to sort this out, and that means we're not going to accept any crumbs." She placed an envelope on the table, and all eyes turned to it. The envelope contained all the documents needed to formalize the legal proceedings that were underway. There was also the request for mediation, now with one crucial detail: the presence of the Department of Justice. The HOA president hesitated, but Karen interrupted. "I thought it would be a good idea to remind you that the Department of Justice is aware of everything, and there's no turning back. Either you do the right thing, or you face legal consequences that will drag all of you down." The tension in the room was palpable. The HOA leader seemed to lose what little composure he still had. He looked at Karen with an expression of pure frustration. "You can't do this, Karen. We're dealing with a problem that could affect our entire community." My sister didn't let it get to her. "If you had done the right thing from the start, we wouldn't be here now. The responsibility of keeping the community together is not just about appearance. It also involves respecting the laws and ensuring accessibility for everyone. Something you've clearly ignored." Karen, in the background, tried to interrupt, but the HOA board itself seemed to start pulling away from her. They began to realize that they were sinking together. The president, sensing that the situation was already out of control, sighed. "What exactly do you want from us?" he asked, his voice trembling. My sister stood up, her gaze sharp. "I want you to rebuild the ramp immediately. I want compensation for the damage, and most importantly, I want Karen to resign her position in the HOA. That's the only way we can resolve this without an even longer and more painful battle." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen was visibly paler. The woman who had always been so imposing was now small, almost unrecognizable, in front of all the HOA members. "You're demanding too much," she tried to argue, but her voice trembled. My sister looked at her with a smile that wasn't one of triumph, but of pure justice. "I'm only demanding what's right, Karen, and however difficult it may be, you're going to have to accept it." The meeting ended at that point, without further discussion. They knew there was no escape from the situation. The HOA was forced to accept what was imposed. In the following days, the ramp was rebuilt as requested, compensation was paid, and Karen finally had to resign her position. It was such a fall from grace that it almost seemed fictitious. And so, the HOA lost the battle it thought it could win. Justice was served, and the community finally breathed a sigh of relief. The neighborhood, which had been the scene of so many injustices, now looked different. The HOA, without Karen to run it, was restructuring. Unfair fines were disappearing, stricter rules were being revised. But more important than all that, my sister's victory was a lesson. The power of law, justice, and truth will always prevail, even in the most unequal of battles. The HOA may have tried to bring down my sister's ramp, but in the end, she was the one who brought the HOA down. If you liked this true story, don't forget to leave a like and, of course, a comment. See you later.